Today, we're getting a better sense of how states nationwide are beginning to consider reopening their economies. The planning efforts come as the U.S. Commerce Department reports some grim numbers. Retail sales dropped 8.7 points in March, making it the biggest one-month plunge on record.
Yeah, a quick snapshot now of just what it looks like in this country when it comes to COVID-19 cases. As of today, nearly 610,000 people have been diagnosed with the virus, and more than 26,000 Americans have died. Paula Reid has the latest from the White House.
I will then be authorizing each individual governor of each individual state to implement a reopening.
At his briefing yesterday, President Trump made a dramatic about-face in his ongoing feud with state governors, conceding they can decide when to open their local economies.
The governors are going to do a good job, and if they don't do a good job, we're going to come down on them very hard.
President Trump promises to issue revised social distancing guidelines soon and said he's singling out over 20 states to reopen first.
It's going to be very, very close, maybe even before the date of May 1st.
But in an interview with the Associated Press, Dr. Anthony Fauci, who wasn't at the briefing yesterday, said that Target is a bit overly optimistic as the U.S. does not yet have the critical testing and tracing procedures needed to begin reopening the nation's economy.
We have to have something in place that is efficient and that we can rely on, and we're not there yet.
The president seemed to dismiss his point.
Well, I don't know. Look, I don't know. I don't know what he said.
My question is,
Nobody knows.
The president also announced he will suspend funding for the World Health Organization, the international body which is coordinating the global fight against this pandemic through actions like shipping life-saving medical supplies to 95 countries.
The reality is that the WHO failed to adequately obtain, vet, and share information in a timely and transparent fashion.
The president claims the outbreak could have been contained in China if the organization had objectively addressed the situation instead of taking China's reporting at face value. But even after the group declared a health emergency on January 30th, more than a week later, the president was saying this about China.
Well, I think China is very, professionally run in the sense that they have everything under control.
And with a massive trade deal hanging in the balance, the president still appears unwilling to directly confront China.
I don't talk about China's transparency.
All right, so let's bring in Paula Reid. She's at the White House. Paula, about this WHO funding, the thing about the WHO is it's the World Health Organization. It's not just for America, though. It provides an incredible service and information and knowledge to the U.S., but also a lot of support for countries that do not have the same level of health care that we have here in the U.S. I'm wondering what the reaction has been to the president's announcement that he would like to cut funding.
Well, the U.S. is the biggest single donor to the World Health Organization, providing approximately 15% of its budget. And as you heard, the president's argument is that the World Health Organization did not do enough, not only to push back and demand transparency for China, but also just to provide accurate information to the rest of the world. He is not alone in those criticisms, but this move has drawn some criticism of its own. Folks saying this is not the time or the place to pull funding for this critical organization. Earlier today, one of the top officials at the World Health Organization said, quote, "There is no time to waste." They argue that their singular focus right now is protecting people from COVID-19, and now is not the time to pull important funding from the organization, though the White House says the World Health Organization already has its money. It's just going forward, they're suspending funding. But earlier today, on CBS This Morning, the head of the CDC was asked about this, and he said that he will continue to work side by side with the WHO to prevent the spread of disease and help the American people. So it appears that the relationship continues as the White House reviews whether it wants to continue funding at this level.
So, Paula, as you know, the funding that the president has threatened to cut off from the World Health Organization and is now doing seems to be lining up with a new tack that is coming from the Trump campaign, including the president himself, which is to blame China for this pandemic. And yet, as the president continues to do that, and as he even seeks to tie Joe Biden to China, there's a couple of things to remember. Number one, that the Trump family, including Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner, have all had deals in China. So it's not just the Bidens who've conducted business in China, specifically the former vice president's son. More importantly, the president of the United States, throughout the course of this, you've sat in that briefing room multiple times. The president has praised his friend Xi Jinping multiple times, and now all of a sudden seems to be shifting that tone. What do you make of that?
So the president's approach to China in all of this has been varied. Let's go back to late January. He told me in Davos that he believed China had the coronavirus situation under control. He continued to praise China until he sort of changed his rhetoric, and he started referring to this as, of course, the Chinese virus, the Wuhan virus. There was some pushback on that rhetorical strategy, trying to pin the blame or more blame on China, accusing him of xenophobia or scapegoating. But a lot of the China hardliners, particularly in the Republican Party, they have held steadfast in their belief that China has cost American lives. They've been bolstered by intelligence reports that suggest that China was suppressing accurate information. Even this week, Senator Rubio, he tweeted that the Communist Party, has lied about coronavirus at every stage of the pandemic. That's significant because at the same time, the president has once again shifted his rhetoric with China, instead taking on a much more conciliatory tone. Several weeks ago, he stopped referring to this as the Chinese virus. And when he's been asked specifically about whether there will be any ramifications for China, he doesn't really give any specifics and often brings up trade. Remember, there's an enormous trade deal that hangs in the balance. And there have been questions about whether the president has at any point in this response put U.S. economic interests above the broader public health response. Now, I specifically asked the president why there have not been repercussions directly for China. Here he's pulling funding or suspending funding from the WHO because of their reliance on China, but what about China itself? He said that if there were any ramifications, I would be the last person on earth he would tell.
Yeah, I remember that.
Wow, okay. So meantime, Paula, the Washington Post has obtained some documents outlining the CDC and FEMA's plan to reopen the country. Give us some of the details of that plan, and how does it compare to what we've been hearing from the president?
So this is an early draft that was obtained by the Washington Post, and it's interesting. It's a roadmap for how they would try to reopen the country. It comes at it from a public health perspective, not necessarily an economic perspective, but obviously the two have to go hand in hand. It's divided into 3 phases. The first phase really focuses on communicating with people, explaining to them how they need to continue their mitigation efforts, their social distancing, but also beginning to help people understand how the government will roll those back. In the second phase, they talk about ramping up production and manufacturing of tests, and also hiring more healthcare workers to support this massive healthcare response. That second phase goes until about May 15th, and it's not until the third phase that they would actually start to reopen portions of society under this plan. But they argue that cannot happen before May 1st. But what complicates this plan from the CDC and FEMA is that the president continues to send mixed messages about who exactly it is that gets to decide when certain portions of the country open up.
Speaking of opening up, Paula, so as you know, on Tuesday, the president announced that he would be speaking to all 50 governors shortly, and I just want to quote from what the president said. "I will then be authorizing each individual governor of each individual state to implement a reopening, very powerful reopening of their state in a time, in a manner in which is most appropriate." Now, that's a considerable backtrack from, as you know, Paula, 24 hours earlier when the president said he had total authority to decide when the country's economy gets back rolling. So what are you hearing from the White House as to why the president seemed to walk those comments back? Is it because so many folks on both sides of the aisle and constitutional experts essentially said that the president was wrong in decrying that he had total authority when it comes to deciding on this particular point?
Well, it's politically, logistically, and legally impossible for the president to try to flip a switch and reopen the U.S. As you noted, he said earlier this week that he believes his power is absolute, but there is no constitutional basis. And again, these mixed messages, these contradictory approaches throughout this unprecedented crisis can lead to a lot of confusion. Just earlier this week, he said he had the power to do it, but yesterday he said he is going to pretty much defer to the state leaders. If he doesn't like what they're doing, he may try to step in, but didn't offer specifics about exactly what that meant. Up until now, he has largely deferred to the states to respond to this pandemic, to obtain their own PPE, their own medical equipment. He's largely deferred to those local leaders, so it was surprising when he said all of a sudden, even though he deferred to them to close down their economies and their societies, that now he was going to be the one to flip the switch. He's backed off of that a little bit, but again, a lot of this is the fact that the U.S. is geographically a very diverse place. Officials inside the White House have said repeatedly that when they do this assessment, it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all when they determine what parts of the country are ready to reopen. You have different areas of the country that have been impacted in different ways. They'll need different plans to come out of this. It's not a one-size-fits-all. That's, I think, why you saw these two groups of governors, one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast, band together and effectively say, look, we're not going to have the president make these decisions. We're going to get together. We're going to make regional based decisions on what's best for our residents. And that's all part of why the president, again, legally, politically, just logistically, he could not try to reopen the country unilaterally.
So, Paula,
yeah, I mean, it's the idea of using that word authorizing the governors. You know, that word authorize, the governors already have it within their ability and their powers to decide in the best interest of the citizens of the state. So I think that a lot of people took particular note of that use of language. Sorry, Emery.
That's okay. You know, in the meantime, while the powers that be are sort of wrangling over the reopening and how that will happen, people are still waiting for those stimulus checks to get them by. A good portion of the country still waiting. We've heard that the president's name will be on the stimulus checks. There's some reporting that they were delayed in order to print the president's name on the check. Now, the Treasury Department denies that that is the case at all. But, you know, it is an election year. And you gotta wonder, because the president's name has never been printed on a stimulus check before, whether or not November was perhaps top of mind when considering the way these checks would be presented.
Well, it's important to note that this money is coming out of a bipartisan deal. If you receive a $1,200 check, yes, the president signed that bill, but that was passed with bipartisan cooperation. And to your question about whether this would be the first time, this would be the first time a president's name appears on an IRS disbursement. He does not actually have the power to sign these kinds of disbursements. It's usually a civil servant who would do that because, again, it's not his business. It's not his money. This is taxpayer money. We have reached out. The government insists that there will be no delays in these checks. They're not all coming out at once. Many people are now getting them through direct deposit. Other people who don't have direct deposit set up, either for your tax refund or for Social Security, they may be getting one of these physical paper checks, but the timeline has always been that those would come a little bit later, and right now it's just unclear if they will be delayed to get his name on them.
Really, really interesting. Paula Reid for us at the White House, as always now in this critical period of time, Paula, providing that clarity that we so desperately need. We appreciate it as always.